Book 4, Chapter 6, Amelia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Amelia, by Henry Fielding, Book 4, Chapter 6, in which may appear that violence is sometimes done to the name of love. When that happy day came, in which unhallowed hands are forbidden to contaminate the shoulders of the unfortunate, Booth went early to the Colonel's house, and being admitted to his presence, began with great freedom, though without great gentleness, to complain of his having not dealt with him with more openness. "Why, my dear Colonel," said he, "would you not acquaint me with that secret which this letter hath disclosed?" James read the letter, at which his countenance changed more than once, and then, after a short silence, said, "Mr. Booth, I have been to blame, I own it, and you upbraid me with justice. The true reason was that I was ashamed of my own folly. Damn me, Booth, if I have not been a consummate fool, a very dupe to this woman, and she hath a particular pleasure in making me so. I know what the impertinence of virtue is, and I can submit to it, but to be treated thus by a whore— You must forgive me, dear Booth, but your success was a kind of triumph over me, which I could not bear. I own I have not the least reason to conceive any anger against you, and yet curse me if I should not have been less displeased at your lying with my own wife. Nay, I could almost have parted with half my fortune to you more willingly than have suffered you to receive that trifle of my money which you received at her hands. However, I ask your pardon, and I promise you I will never more think of you with the same ill will on the account of this woman. But as for her, damn me if I do not enjoy her by some means or other, whatever it costs me, for I am already above 200 pounds out of pocket, without having scarce had a smile in return." Booth expressed much astonishment at this declaration. He said he could not conceive how it was possible to have such an affection for a woman who did not show the least inclination to return it. James gave her a hearty curse, and said, "Pox of her inclination! I want only the possession of her person, and that, you will allow, is a very fine one. But, besides my passion for her, she hath now piqued my pride. For how can a man of my fortune brook being refused by a whore?" "Since you are so set on the business," cries Booth, "you will excuse my saying so, I fancy you had better change your method of applying to her; for as she is perhaps the vainest woman upon earth, your bounty may probably do you little service, nay, may rather actually oblige her. Vanity is plainly her predominant passion, and if you will administer to that, it will infallibly throw her into your arms. To this I attribute my own fortunate success. While she relieved my wants and distresses, she was daily feeding her own vanity, whereas, as every gift of yours asserted your superiority, it rather offended than pleased her. Indeed, women generally love to be of the obliging side, and if we examine their favourites, we shall find them to be much oftener such as they have conferred obligations on than such as they have received them from." There was something in this speech which pleased the Colonel, and he said with a smile, "I don't know how it is, Will, but you know women better than I." "Perhaps, Colonel," said Booth, "I have studied their minds more." "I don't, however, much envy your knowledge," replied the other, "for I never think their minds worth considering. However, I hope I shall profit a little by your experience with Miss Matthews. Damnation seize the proud, insolent harlot. The devil take me if I don't love her more than I ever loved a woman." The rest of their conversation turned on Booth's affairs. The Colonel again resumed the part of a friend, gave him the remainder of the money, and promised to take the first opportunity of laying his memorial before a great man. Booth was greatly overjoyed at this success. Nothing now lay on his mind but to conceal his frailty from Amelia, to whom he was afraid Miss Matthews, in the rage of her resentment, would communicate. This apprehension made him stay almost constantly at home, and he trembled at every knock to the door. His fear, moreover, betrayed him into a meanness which he would have heartily despised on any other occasion. This was to order the maid to deliver him any letter directed to Amelia, at the same time strictly charging her not to acquaint her mistress with her having received any such orders. A servant of any acuteness would have formed strange conjectures from such an injunction, but this poor girl was of perfect simplicity. So great indeed was her simplicity, that had not Amelia been void of all suspicion of her husband, the maid would have soon after betrayed her master. One afternoon, while they were drinking tea, little Betty, so the maid was called, came into the room, and calling her master forth, delivered him a card which was directed to Amelia. Booth, having read the card, on his return into the room, chid the girl for calling him, saying, "If you can read, child, you must see it was directed to your mistress." To this the girl answered, pertly enough, "I am sure, sir, you ordered me to bring every letter first to you." This hint, with many women, would have been sufficient to have blown up the whole affair, but Amelia, who heard what the girl said, through the medium of love and confidence, saw the matter in a much better light than it deserved, and looking tenderly on her husband, said, "Indeed, my love, I must blame you for a conduct which perhaps I ought rather to praise, as it proceeds only from the extreme tenderness of your affection. But why will you endeavour to keep any secrets from me? Believe me, for my own sake, you ought not, for as you cannot hide the consequences, you make me always suspect 10 times worse than the reality. While I have you and my children well before my eyes, I am capable of facing any news which can arrive, for what ill news can come, unless indeed it concerns my little babe in the country, which doth not relate to the badness of our circumstances, and those, I thank heaven, we have now a fair prospect of retrieving. Besides, dear Billy, though my understanding can be much inferior to yours, I have sometimes had the happiness of luckily hitting on some argument which hath afforded you comfort. This, you know, my dear, was the case with regard to Colonel James, whom I persuaded you to think you had mistaken, and you see the event provided me in the right. So happily for herself and Mr. Booth did the excellence of this good woman's disposition deceive her. The card, being now inspected, was found to contain the compliments of Mrs. James to Mrs. Booth, with an account of her being arrived in town, and having brought with her a very great cold. Amelia was overjoyed at the news of her arrival, and having dressed herself in the utmost hurry, left her children to the care of her husband, and ran away to pay her respects to her friend, whom she loved with the most sincere affection. But how was she disappointed when, eager with the most utmost patience, and exulting with the thoughts of presently seeing her beloved friend, she was answered at the door that the lady was not at home, nor could she, upon telling her name, obtain any admission. This, considering the account she had received of the lady's cold, greatly surprised her, and she returned home very much vexed at her disappointment. Amelia, who had no suspicion that Mrs. James was really at home, and, as the phrase is, was denied, would have made a second visit the next morning had she not been prevented by a cold which she herself now got, and which was attended with a slight fever. This confined her several days to her house, during which Booth officiated as her nurse and never stirred from her. In all this time she heard not a word from Mrs. James, which gave her some uneasiness, but more astonishment. The 10th day, when she was perfectly recovered, about 9 in the evening, when she and her husband were just going to supper, she heard a most violent thundering at the door, and presently after a rustling of silk upon her staircase. At the same time a female voice carried out pretty loudly, "Bless me, what, am I to climb up another pair of stairs?" Upon which Amelia, who well knew the voice, presently ran to the door and ushered in Mrs. James, most splendidly dressed, who put on as formal a countenance, and made a formal curtsy to her old friend, as if she had been her very distant acquaintance. Poor Amelia, who was going to rush into her friend's arms, was struck motionless by this behaviour, but recollecting her spirits, as she had an excellent presence of mind, she presently understood what the lady meant, and resolved to treat her in her own way. Down, therefore, the company sat, and silence prevailed for some time, during which Mrs. James surveyed the room with more attention than she would have bestowed on one much finer. At length the conversation began, in which the weather and the diversions of the town were well canvassed. Amelia, who was a woman of great humour, performed her part to admiration, so that a bystander would have doubted, in every other article than dress, which of the two was the most accomplished fine lady. After a visit of 20 minutes, during which not a word of any former occurrences was mentioned, nor indeed any subject of discourse started, except only those two above mentioned, Mrs. James rose from her chair and retired in the same formal manner in which she had approached. We will pursue her for the sake of the contrast during the rest of the evening. She went from Amelia directly to a rout, where she spent 2 hours in a crowd of company, talked again and again over the diversions and news of the town, played 2 rubbers at whist, and then retired to her own apartment, where, having passed another hour in undressing herself, she went to her own bed. Booth and his wife, the moment their companion was gone, sat down to supper on a piece of cold meat, the remains of their dinner, after which, over a pint of wine, they entertained themselves for a while with the ridiculous behaviour of their visitant. But Amelia, declaring she rather saw her as the object of pity than anger, turned the discourse to pleasanter topics. The little action of their children, the former scenes and future prospects of their life, furnished them with many pleasant ideas, and the contemplation of Amelia's recovery threw Booth into raptures. At length they retired, happy in each other. It is possible some readers may be no less surprised at the behaviour of Mrs. James than was Amelia herself, since they may have perhaps received so favourable an impression of that lady from the account given of her by Mr. Booth, that her present demeanour may seem unnatural and inconsistent with her former character. But they will be pleased to consider the great alteration in her circumstances. From the state of dependency on her brother, who was himself no better than a soldier of fortune, to that of being wife to a man of very large estate and considerable rank in life. And what was her present behaviour more than that of a fine lady who considered form and show as essential ingredients of human happiness, and imagined all friendship to consist in ceremony, courtesies, messages, and visits, in which opinion she hath the honour to think with much the larger part of one sex, and no small number with the other. End Book 4, Chapter 6. Book 4, Chapter 7. Amelia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Amelia by Henry Fielding, Book 4, Chapter 7, containing a very extraordinary and pleasant incident. The next evening Booth and Amelia went to walk in the park with their children. They were now on the verge of the parade, and Booth was describing to his wife the several buildings around it, when, on a sudden, Amelia, missing her little boy, cried out, "Where is little Billy?" Upon which Booth, casting his eyes over the grass, saw a foot soldier shaking him at a little distance. At this sight, without making any answer to his wife, he leapt over the rails, and running directly up to the fellow, who had a firelock with the bayonet fixed in his hand, he seized him by the collar and tripped up his heels, and at the same time wrested his arms from him. A sergeant upon duty, seeing the affray at some distance, ran presently up, and being told what had happened, gave the sentinel a hearty curse, and told him he deserved to be hanged. A bystander gave this information, for Booth was returned with his little boy to meet Amelia, who staggered towards him as fast as she could, all pale and breathless, and scarce able to support her tottering limbs. The sergeant now came up to Booth to make an apology for the behaviour of the soldier, when of a sudden he turned almost as pale as Amelia himself. He stood silent whilst Booth was employed in comforting and recovering his wife, and then addressing himself to him, said, "Bless me, lieutenant, could I imagine it had been your honour, and was it my little master that the rascal used so? I am glad I did not know it, for I should certainly have run my halbert into him." Booth presently recognized his old faithful servant Atkinson, and gave him such a hearty greeting, saying he was very glad to see him in his present situation. "Whatever I am," answered the sergeant, "I shall always think I owe it to your honour." Then taking the little boy by the hand, he cried, "What a vast fine young gentleman master has grown!" and cursing the soldier's inhumanity, swore heartily he would make him pay for it. As Amelia was much disordered with her fright, she did not recollect her foster brother till he was introduced to her by Booth. But she no sooner knew him than she bestowed a most obliging smile on him, and calling him by the name of honest Joe, said she was heartily glad to see him in England. "See, my dear," cries Booth, "what preferment your old friend is to you. You would scarce know him, I believe, in his present state of finery." "I am very well pleased to see it," answered Amelia, "and I wish him joy of being made an officer with all my heart." In fact, from what Mr. Booth said, joined to the sergeant's laced coat, she believed that he had obtained a commission. So weak and absurd is human vanity, that this mistake of Amelia's possibly put poor Atkinson out of countenance, for he looked at this instant more silly than he had ever done in his life, and making her a most respectful bow, muttered something about obligations, in a scarce articulate or intelligible manner. The sergeant had, indeed, among many other qualities, that modesty which a Latin author honours by the name of ingenuous. Nature had given him this, notwithstanding the meanness of his birth, and 6 years' conversation in the army had not taken it away. To say the truth, he was a noble fellow, and Amelia, by supposing he had a commission in the guards, had been guilty of no affront to that honourable body. Booth had a real affection for Atkinson, though in fact he knew not half his merit. He acquainted him with his lodgings, where he earnestly desired to see him. Amelia, who was far from being recovered from the terrors into which the seeing her husband engaged with the soldier had thrown her, desired to go home, nor was she well able to walk without some assistance. While she supported herself, therefore, on her husband's arm, she told Atkinson she should be obliged to him if he would take care of the children. He readily accepted the office, but upon offering his hand to Miss, she refused, and burst into tears. Upon which the tender mother resigned Booth to her children, and put herself under the sergeant's protection, who conducted her safe home, though she often declared she feared she should drop down by the way, the fear of which so affected the sergeant, for besides the honour which he himself had for the lady, he knew how tenderly his friend loved her, that he was unable to speak, and had not his nerves been so strongly braced that nothing could shake them, he had enough in his mind to have set him a-trembling equally with the lady. When they arrived at the lodgings, the mistress of the house opened the door, who, seeing Amelia's condition, threw open the parlour and begged her to walk in, upon which she immediately flung herself into a chair, and all present thought she would have fainted away. However, she escaped that misery, and having drank a glass of water with a little white wine mixed in it, she began in a little time to regain her complexion, and at length assured Booth that she was perfectly recovered, but declared she had never undergone so much, and earnestly begged him never to be so rash for the future. She then called her little boy, and gently chid him, saying, "You must never do so more, Billy. See what mischief you might have brought upon your father, and what you would have made me suffer." "La, mamma," said the child, "what harm did I do? I did not know that people might not walk in the green fields in London. I am sure if I did a fault, the man punished me enough for it, for he pinched me almost through my slender arm." He then bared his little arm, which was greatly discoloured by the injury it had received. Booth uttered a most dreadful execration at this sight, and the sergeant, who was now present, did the like. Atkinson now returned to his guard, and went directly to the officers to acquaint him with the soldier's inhumanity. But he, who was about 15 years of age, gave the sergeant a great curse, and said the soldier had done very well, for that idle boys ought to be corrected. This, however, did not satisfy poor Atkinson, who the next day, as soon as the guard was relieved, beat the fellow most unmercifully, and told him he would remember him as long as he stayed in the regiment. Thus ended this trifling adventure, which some readers will perhaps be pleased at seeing related at full length. None, I think, can fail drawing one observation from it, namely, how capable the most insignificant accident is of disturbing human happiness, and of producing the most unexpected and dreadful events, a reflection which may serve to many moral and religious uses. This accident produced the first acquaintance between the mistress of the house and her lodgers, for hitherto they had scarce exchanged a word together. But the great concern which the good woman had shown on Amelia's account at this time was not likely to pass unobserved or unthanked by either the husband or wife. Amelia, therefore, as soon as she was able to go upstairs, invited Mrs. Ellingson, for that was her name, to her apartment, and desired the favour of her to stay to supper. She readily complied, and they passed a very agreeable evening together, in which the two women seemed to have conceived a most extraordinary liking to each other. Though beauty in general doth not greatly recommend one woman to another, as it is too apt to create envy, yet in cases where this passion doth not interfere, a fine woman is often a pleasing objective even to some of her own sex, especially when her beauty is attended with a certain degree of affability, as was that of Amelia in the highest degree. She was indeed a most charming woman, and I know not whether the little scar on her nose did not rather add to than diminish her beauty. Mrs. Ellingson, therefore, was as much charmed with the loveliness of her fair lodger as with all her other engaging qualities. She was indeed so taken with Amelia's beauty that she could not refrain from crying out, in a kind of transport of admiration, "Upon my word, Captain Booth, you are the happiest man in the world. Your lady is so extremely handsome that one cannot look at her without pleasure." This good woman had herself none of these attractive charms to the eye. Her person was short and immoderately fat. Her features were none of the most regular, and her complexion, if indeed she ever had a good one, had considerably suffered by time. Her good humour and complaisance, however, were highly pleasing to Amelia. Nay, why should we conceal the secret satisfaction which that lady felt from the compliments paid to her person, since such of my readers as like her best will not be sorry to find that she was a woman. End of Book 4, Chapter 7. Book 4, Chapter 8, Amelia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Amelia by Henry Fielding. Book 4, Chapter 8, containing various matters. A fortnight had now passed since Booth had seen or heard from the Colonel, which did not a little surprise him, as they had parted so good friends, and as he had so cordially undertaken his cause concerning the memorial on which all his hopes depended. The uneasiness which this gave him farther increased on finding that his friend refused to see him, for he had paid the Colonel a visit at 9 in the morning, and was told he was not stirring, and at his return back an hour afterwards, the servant said his master was gone out, of which Booth was certain of the falsehood, for he had during that whole hour walked backwards and forwards within sight of the Colonel's door, and must have seen him if he had gone out within that time. The good Colonel, however, did not long suffer his friend to continue in the deplorable state of anxiety, for the very next morning Booth received his memorial enclosed in a letter, acquainting him that Mr. James had mentioned his affair to the person he proposed, but that the great man had so many engagements on his hands that it was impossible for him to make any further promises at this time. The cold and distant style of this letter, and indeed the whole behaviour of James, so different from what it had been formerly, had something so mysterious in it, that it greatly puzzled and perplexed poor Booth, and it was so long before he was able to solve it, that the reader's curiosity will perhaps be obliged to us for not leaving him so long in the dark as to this matter. The true reason, then, of the Colonel's conduct was this: his unbounded generosity, together with the unbounded extravagance, and consequently the great necessity of Miss Matthews, had at length overcome the cruelty of that lady, with whom he likewise had luckily no rival. Above all, the desire of being revenged on Booth, with whom she was to the highest degree enraged, had perhaps contributed not a little to his success, for she had no sooner condescended to a familiarity with her new lover, and discovered that Captain James, of whom she heard so much from Booth, was no other than the identical Colonel, than she employed every art of which she was mistress to make an utter breach of friendship between these two. For this purpose she did not scruple to insinuate that the Colonel was not at all obliged to the character given of him by his friend, and to the account of this latter she placed most of the cruelty with which she had shown to the former. Had the Colonel made a proper use of his reason, and fairly examined the probability of the fact, he could scarce have been imposed upon to believe a matter so inconsistent with all he knew of Booth, and in which that gentleman must have sinned against all the laws of honour without any visible temptation. But in solemn fact, the Colonel was so intoxicated with his love that it was in the power of his mistress to persuade him of anything. Besides, he had an interest in giving her credit, for he was not a little pleased with finding a reason for hating the man whom he could not help hating without any reason, at least without any which he durst fairly assign even to himself. Henceforth, therefore, he abandoned all friendship for Booth, and was more inclined to put him out of the world than to endeavour any longer at supporting him in it. Booth communicated this letter to his wife, who endeavoured as usual to put the utmost of her power to console him under one of the greatest afflictions I think can befall a man, namely the unkindness of a friend. But he had luckily at the same time the greatest blessing in his profession, the kindness of a faithful and beloved wife. A blessing, however, which, though it compensates most of the evils of life, rather serves to aggravate the misfortune of distressed circumstances, from the consideration of the share which she is to bear in them. This afternoon Amelia received a second visit from Mrs. Ellison, who acquainted her that she had a present of a ticket for the oratorio, which could carry 2 persons into the gallery, and therefore begged the favour of her company thither. Amelia, with many thanks, acknowledged the civility of Mrs. Ellison, but declined accepting her offer, upon which Booth very strenuously insisted on her going, and said to her, "My dear, if you knew the satisfaction I have in any of your pleasures, I am convinced you would not refuse the favour Mrs. Ellison is so kind to offer you, for as you are a lover of music, you who have never been at an oratorio cannot conceive how you will be delighted." "I well know your goodness, my dear," answered Amelia, "but I cannot think of leaving my children without some person more proper to take care of them than this poor girl." Mrs. Ellison removed this objection by offering her own servant, a very discreet matron, to attend them. But notwithstanding this and all she could say, with the assistance of Booth and the children themselves, Amelia still persisted in her refusal, and the mistress of the house, who knew how far good breeding allows persons to be pressing on these occasions, took her leave. She was no sooner departed than Amelia, looking tenderly on her husband, said, "How can you, my dear creature, think that music hath any charms for me at this time? Or indeed do you believe that I am capable of any sensation worthy of the name of pleasure, when neither you nor my children are present, or bear any part of it?" An officer of the regiment to which Booth had formerly belonged, hearing from Atkinson where he lodged, now came to pay him a visit. He told him that several of their old acquaintances were to meet the next Wednesday at a tavern, and very strongly pressed him to be one of the company. Booth was, in truth, what is called a hearty fellow, and loved now and then to take a cheerful glass with his friends, but he excused himself at this time. His friend declared he would take no denial, and he growing very importune, Amelia at length seconded him. Upon this Booth answered, "Well, my dear, since you desire me, I will comply, but on one condition, that you go at the same time to the oratorio." Amelia thought this request reasonable enough, and gave her consent, of which Mrs. Ellison presently received the news, and with great satisfaction. It may perhaps be asked why Booth could go to the tavern, and not to the oratorio with his wife. In truth, then, the tavern was within hallowed ground, that is to say, in the verge of the court. For, of 5 officers that were to meet there, 3, besides Booth, were confined to that air which hath been always found extremely wholesome to a broken military constitution. And here, if the good reader will pardon the pun, he will scarce be offended at the observation, since how is it possible that, without running in debt, any person should maintain the dress and appearance of a gentleman whose income is not half so good as that of a porter? It is true that this allowance, small as it is a great expense to the public. But if several more unnecessary charges were spared, the public might, perhaps, bear a little increase of this without much feeling it. They would not, I am sure, have equal reason to complain at contributing to the maintenance of a set of brave fellows, who, at the hazard of their health, their limbs, and their lives, have maintained the safety and honour of their country, as when they find themselves taxed to support a set of drones who have not the least merit or claim to their favour, and who, without contributing in any manner to the good of the hive, live luxuriously on the labours of the industrious bee. End of Book 4, Chapter 8. Book 4, Chapter 9, Amelia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Amelia by Henry Fielding, Book 4, Chapter 9, in which Amelia, with her friend, goes to the oratorio. Nothing happened between Monday and the Wednesday worthy a place in this history. Upon the evening of the latter, the two ladies went to the oratorio, and were there time enough to get a first row in the gallery. Indeed, there was only one person in the house when they came, for Amelia's inclinations, when she gave a loose to them, were pretty eager for this diversion, she being a great lover of music, and particularly of Mr. Handel's compositions. Mrs. Ellison was, I suppose, a great lover likewise of music, for she was the more impatient of the two, which was rather the more extraordinary, as these entertainments were not such novelties to her as they were to poor Amelia. Though our ladies arrived 2 full hours before they saw the back of Mr. Handel, yet this time of expectation did not hang extremely heavily on their hands, for besides their own chat, they had the company of a gentleman whom they found at their first arrival in the gallery, and who, though plainly or rather roughly dressed, very luckily for the women, happened to be not only well bred, but a person of very lively conversation. The gentleman, on his part, seemed highly charmed with Amelia, and in fact was so, for though he restrained himself entirely within the rules of good breeding, yet he was in the highest degree officious to catch at every opportunity of showing his respect and doing her little services. He procured her a book and wax candle, and held the candle for her himself during the whole entertainment. At the end of the oratorio he declared he would not leave the ladies till he had seen them safe into their chairs or coach, and at the same time very earnestly entreated that he might have the honour of waiting upon them. Upon which Mrs. Ellison, who was a very good-humoured woman, answered, "Ay, sure, sir, if you please. You have been very obliging to us, and a dish of tea shall be at your service at any time," and then told him where she lived. The ladies were no sooner seated in their hackney coach than Mrs. Ellison burst into a loud laughter, and cried, "I'll be hanged, madam, if you had not made a conquest to-night, and what is very pleasant, I believe the poor gentleman takes you for a single lady." "Nay," answered Amelia very gravely, "I protest I began to think at last he was rather too particular, though he did not venture at a word that I could be offended at. But if you fancy any such thing, I am sorry you invited him to drink tea." "Why so?" replied Mrs. Ellison. "Are you angry with a man for liking you? If you are, you will be angry with almost every man that sees you. If I was a man myself, I declare I should be in the number of your admirers. Poor gentleman, I pity him heartily. He little knows that you have not a heart to dispose of. For my own part, I should not be surprised at seeing a serious proposal of marriage, for I am convinced he is a man of fortune, not only by the politeness of his address, but by the fineness of his linen, and that valuable diamond ring on his finger. But you will see more of him when he comes to tea." "Indeed I shall not," answered Amelia, "though I believe you only rally me. I hope you have a better opinion of me than to think I would go willingly into the company of a man who had an improper liking for me." Mrs. Ellison, who was one of the gayest women in the world, repeated the words, improper liking, with a laugh, and cried, "My dear Mrs. Booth, believe me, you are too handsome and too good-humoured for a prude. How can you affect being offended at what I am convinced is the greatest pleasure of womankind, and chiefly, I believe, of us virtuous women? For I assure you, notwithstanding my gaiety, I am as virtuous as any prude in Europe." "Far be it from me, madam," said Amelia, "to suspect the contrary of abundance of women who indulge themselves in much greater freedoms than I should take, or have any pleasure in taking. For I solemnly protest, if I know my own heart, the liking of all men but of one is a matter quite indifferent to me, or rather would be highly disagreeable." This discourse brought them home, where Amelia, finding her children asleep, and her husband not returned, invited her companion to partake of her homely fare, and down they sat to supper together. The clock struck 12, and no news being arrived of Booth, Mrs. Ellison began to express some astonishment at his stay, whence she launched into a general reflection on husbands, and soon passed to some particular invectives of her own. "Ah, my dear madam," says she, "I know the present state of your mind, by what I have myself often felt formerly. I am no stranger to the melancholy tone of a midnight clock. It was my misfortune to drag on a heavy chain above 15 years with a sottish yoke-fellow. But how can I wonder at my fate, since I see even your superior charms cannot confine a husband from the bewitching pleasures of a bottle?" "Indeed, madam," says Amelia, "I have no reason to complain. Mr. Booth is one of the soberest of men, but now and then to spend a late hour with his friend is, I think, highly excusable." "Oh, no doubt," cries Mrs. Ellison, "if he can excuse himself. But if I was a man—" Here Booth came in and interrupted the discourse. Amelia's eyes flashed with joy the moment he appeared, and he discovered no less pleasure in seeing her. His spirits were indeed a little elevated with wine, so as to heighten his good humour, without in the least disordering his understanding, and made him such delightful company, that though it was past 1 in the morning, neither his wife nor Mrs. Ellison thought of their beds during the whole hour. Early the next morning the serjeant came to Mr. Booth's lodgings, and with a melancholy countenance acquainted him that he had been the night before at an alehouse, where he heard one Mr. Murphy, an attorney, declared that he would get a warrant backed against one Captain Booth at the next board of green-cloth. "I hope, sir," said he, "your honour will pardon me, but by what he said I was afraid he meant your honour, and therefore I thought it my duty to tell you, for I knew the same thing happened to a gentleman here the other day." Booth gave Mr. Atkinson many thanks for his information. "I doubt not," said he, "but I am the person he meant, for it would be foolish in me to deny that I am liable to apprehensions of that sort." "I hope, sir," said the serjeant, "your honour will soon have reason to fear no man living, but in the meantime, if any accident should happen, my bail is at your service, as far as it will go, and I'm a housekeeper, and can swear myself worth £100. Which hearty and friendly declaration received all those acknowledgments from Booth which it really deserved. The poor gentleman was greatly alarmed at the news, but he was altogether as much surprised at Murphy's being the attorney employed against him, as all his debts, except only to Captain James, arose in the country, where he did not know that Mr. Murphy had any acquaintance. However, he made no doubt that he was the person intended, and resolved to remain a close prisoner in his own lodgings, till he saw the event of a proposal which had been made him the evening before at the tavern, where an honest gentleman who had a post under his government, and who was one of the company, had promised to serve him with the Secretary at War, telling him that he had no doubt of procuring him whole pay in a regiment abroad, which in his present circumstance was very highly worth his acceptance, when indeed that and a jail seemed to be the only alternatives that offered themselves to his choice. Mr. Booth and his lady spent that afternoon with Mrs. Ellison, an incident which we should scarce have mentioned, had it not been that Amelia gave, on this occasion, an instance of that prudence which should never be off its guard in married women of delicacy. For before she would consent to drink tea with Mrs. Ellison, she made conditions that the gentleman who had met them at the oratorio should not be let in. Indeed, this circumspection proved unnecessary in the present instance, for no such visitor ever came. a circumstance which gave great content to Amelia, for that lady had been a little uneasy at the raillery of Mrs. Ellison, and had, upon reflection, magnified every little compliment made her, and every little chivalry shown her by the unknown gentleman, far beyond the truth. These imaginations now all subsided again, and she imputed all that Mrs. Ellison had said either to raillery or mistake. A young lady made a fourth with them at whist, and likewise stayed the whole evening. Her name was Bennet. She was about the age of 25, but sickness had given her an older look, and had a good deal diminished her beauty, of which, young as she was, she plainly appeared to have only the remains in her present possession. She was in one particular the very reverse of Mrs. Ellison, being altogether as remarkably grave as the other was gay. This gravity was not, however, attended with any sourness of temper. On the contrary, she had much sweetness in her countenance, and was perfectly well bred. Amelia imputed her grave deportment to her ill health, and began to entertain a compassion for her, which in good minds, that is to say, in minds capable of compassion, is certain to introduce some little degree of love or friendship. Amelia was, in short, so pleased with the conversation of this lady, that though a woman of no impertinent curiosity, she could not help taking the first opportunity of inquiring who she was. Mrs. Ellison said that she was an unhappy lady who had married a young clergyman for love, who, dying of consumption, had left her a widow in very indifferent circumstances. This account made Amelia still pity her more, and consequently adding to the liking which she had already conceived for her. Amelia therefore desired Mrs. Ellison to bring her acquainted with Mrs. Bennet, and said she would go any day with her to make that lady a visit. "There need be no ceremony," cried Mrs. Ellison. "She is a woman of no form, and as I saw plainly she was extremely pleased with Mrs. Booth, I am convinced I can bring her to tea with you any afternoon you please." The next 2 days Booth continued at home, highly to the satisfaction of his Amelia, who really knew no happiness out of his company, nor scarce any misery in it. She had indeed at all times so much of his company when in his power, that she had no occasion to assign any particular reason for his staying with her, and consequently it could give her no cause of suspicion. The Saturday one of her children was a little disordered with a feverish complaint, which confined her to her room, and prevented her drinking tea in the afternoon with her husband in Mrs. Ellison's apartment, where a noble lord, a cousin of Mrs. Ellison, happened to be present. For though that lady was reduced in her circumstances, and obliged to let out part of her house in lodgings, she was born of a good family, and had some considerable relations. His lordship was himself not in any office of state, but his fortune gave him authority with those who were. Mrs. Ellison, therefore, very bluntly took an opportunity of recommending Booth to his consideration. She took the first hint from my lord's calling the gentleman captain, to which she answered, I wish your lordship would make him so. It would be an act of justice, and I know it is in your power to do much greater things." She then mentioned Booth's services, and the wounds he had received at the siege, of which she had heard a faithful account from Amelia. Booth blushed, and was as silent as a young virgin at the hearing her own praises. His lordship answered, "Cousin Ellison, you know you may command my interest. Nay, I shall have a pleasure in serving one of Mr. Booth's character. For my part, I think merit in all capacities ought to be encouraged, but I know the ministry are greatly pestered with solicitation at this time. However, Mr. Booth may be assured I will take the first opportunity, and in the meantime I shall be glad of seeing him any morning he pleases." For all these declarations, Booth was not wanting in acknowledgments to the generous peer any more than he was in secret gratitude to the lady who had shown so friendly and uncommon a zeal in his favour. The reader, when he knows the character of this nobleman, may perhaps conclude that his seeing Booth alone was a lucky circumstance, for he was so passionate an admirer of women that he could scarce have escaped the attraction of Amelia's beauty. But few men, as I have observed, have such disinterested generosity as to serve a husband the better because they are in love with his wife, unless she will condescend to pay a price beyond the reach of a virtuous woman. End of Book 4, Chapter 9. End of Volume 1.